The crystal decanter shattered against the mahogany door, the amber liquid bleeding into the wood like a fresh wound. Inside the study, the voice that once whispered promises against Elena's neck now sounded like grinding stone. She served her purpose. The man she loved, the man the underworld feared, growled to his lieutenants. The leak came from her circle. I don't care where she goes or what happens to her. By tomorrow morning I want a new woman in that seat. Someone who knows how to stay loyal. Find her replacement. Elena stood in the hallway, her hand frozen inches from the door handle. The weight of the world seemed to collapse into the small velvet-lined box in her pocket, a gift for their 3rd anniversary. The betrayal didn't just sting, it scorched. Every sacrifice she'd made, every shadow she'd stepped into to keep him safe from the vultures circling his throne, was being erased with a single cold command. She didn't cry. She didn't storm in. Instead, she felt a terrifying cold clarity wash over her. If he wanted a world without her, she would give it to him. But she wouldn't leave empty-handed. She carried a secret in her mind and a life in her womb that could bring his entire legacy to its knees. Before we dive into this descent into shadows and secrets, hello to all of you joining us today. It is truly wonderful to have you here. Whether you're watching from the bustling streets of New York, the quiet suburbs of London, or anywhere else across the globe, please let us know in the comments. Where are you watching from today? We love seeing how far our stories travel. How are you all doing? I hope you're ready for a journey of heartbreak and redemption. If you haven't already, please take a moment to hit that subscribe button and join our community. Your support allows us to keep bringing these intense, emotional stories to life, and we don't want you to miss a single twist. Are you subscribed? If not, do it now. You won't want to miss what happens when the woman who knows all the boss's secrets finally decides to use them. Elena retreated into the gloom of the corridor, her footsteps silent on the plush carpet. She knew the security rotations better than the men who pulled the shifts. She knew which cameras had a 3-second lag and which guards could be distracted with a well-timed noise. As she slipped through the service entrance and into the biting chill of the night, she looked back at the towering estate one last time. The man inside, Julian Thorne, named for the grace of a king and the bite of a briar, thought he was discarding a liability. He had no idea he had just unlocked the cage of his own destruction. Elena Hunt walked into the rain, the neon lights of the city reflecting in her eyes like a brewing storm. She wasn't just leaving, she was evaporating. And by the time Julian realized the leak wasn't her, but the very men he was currently trusting to find her replacement, it would be far too late to bring her home. How far would you go to protect someone who already gave up on you? And what happens when the one person holding your empire together decides to let it fall? The rain in the city didn't wash things clean. It only slicked the grime, turning the pavement into a mirror for the neon desperation of the district. Elena Hunt, her first name borrowed from a tragic queen of Troy, her last from the relentless tracker of the IMF, sat in the back of a flickering 24-hour diner, the smell of burnt coffee and cheap vinyl grounding her. She wasn't just a mafia wife or a trophy. She was the daughter of a high-level strategist, a woman who had spent years balancing Julian's ledgers and, more importantly, silencing the whispers that could have led to his assassination. Her deepest desire had always been simple: a life where the scent of gunpowder didn't cling to Julian's expensive wool coats. Her deepest fear: that the darkness he navigated would eventually swallow the man she loved whole, leaving only the monster behind. Standing in that diner, clutching a cold ceramic mug, she realized her fear had finally come true. The man she had shielded for 3 years, the man who used to look at her as if she were the only tether to his humanity, had finally severed the rope. Across town, Julian Thorne, bearing the first name of a Madagascar king and the surname of a California billionaire, poured himself a drink that tasted like ash. He was a man built on the pillars of control and absolute loyalty. To him, betrayal wasn't just a sin. It was a structural weakness that had to be cauterized. He told himself his coldness was a necessity of the throne. He had lost his father to a trusted advisor, and he had sworn he would never be that vulnerable again. Yet as he stared at the empty chair at the head of the long mahogany table, a phantom ache thrummed in his chest. He convinced himself it was just the sting of the perceived leak, not the absence of the woman who used to press her forehead against his when the world got too loud. The supporting players in this theater of shadows were already moving. There was Dominic Toretto, Julian's right hand, sharing a name with a street racer and a refined detective. A man whose loyalty was as thick as his muscle but whose ambition was a silent, creeping vine. Then there was Clara Oswald, Elena's only true confidant, named for a time traveler and a legendary assassin, who operated a high-end boutique that served as a front for information exchange. Clara was the only one who knew that Elena wasn't just a partner. She was the architect of Julian's most successful territorial acquisitions. Elena reached into her bag and pulled out a burner phone. Her hands shook not from cold but from the sheer weight of the secrets she held. She knew the coordinates of the offshore accounts. She knew the names of the judges Julian had in his pocket. And she knew about the Prometheus file, the one piece of evidence that could link Julian to a federal investigation he thought he had buried years ago. But her most dangerous secret wasn't on a hard drive or a ledger. It was the fluttering heartbeat she had confirmed only 48 hours ago. She was carrying the heir to the Thorn Empire, a child conceived in a moment of rare soft peace before the paranoia took hold. "I won't let you grow up in a cage of his making," she whispered to the empty booth. She wasn't just walking away from a man, she was dismantling a dynasty to save a soul. The stakes were no longer about power or territory. They were about survival. If Julian found her, he might try to take the child and discard her. If his rivals found her, they would use her as the ultimate leverage to skin Julian alive. As she stood up to leave, she caught her reflection in the darkened window. She looked fragile, but her eyes held a jagged, diamond-hard resolve. She had played the part of the supportive shadow for too long. It was time for the shadow to become the storm. The silence of the Thorn estate was broken not by an intruder, but by the heavy rhythmic thud of a safe door closing. Inside his study, Julian stared at the empty space on his desk where Elena's framed photograph usually sat. He had thrown it into the fireplace an hour ago, watching the edges curl and blacken. He convinced himself the tightness in his throat was rage, not regret. "The replacement is arriving tonight," Dominic Toretto announced, stepping into the room with the clinical detachment of a man delivering a package. "Her name is Sienna Miller, a first name from a desert traveler, a last from a weary lawman. She's the daughter of the Veduva Syndicate. The alliance will solidify the northern docks. Is efficient. She won't be a distraction like Elena was." Julian nodded, his jaw tight. "Good. Loyalty over sentiment. That was my mistake." But as Julian prepared to welcome a stranger into his bed and his business, the true leak was already meeting in the sublevels of a parking garage. It wasn't Elena who had compromised the shipments. It was Dominic himself, weary of being the shadow to Julian's son. He had whispered the lies into Julian's ear, painting Elena as the mole to remove the only person capable of spotting his own treachery. Meanwhile, Elena wasn't just hiding, she was hunting. She arrived at the boutique of Clara Oswald, her breath hitching as she leaned against the locked glass door. Clara opened it instantly, her eyes widening at the sight of Elena's drenched, pale form. "He's replacing me, Clara," Elena whispered, the words finally breaking through her stoic defense. "He thinks I'm the one who sold out the longshoremen. He's bringing in a Veduva girl to take my place." "That fool," Clara hissed, pulling Elena into the warmth of the shop. "He's blind. If he brings the Veduva family into his inner circle, they'll gut him from the inside out within a month. They've wanted those docks for a decade. I have to stop him," Elena said, her hand instinctively dropping to her stomach. "Not for him. For the child. If the Veduvas take over, they'll kill anyone with Thorn blood. Including this baby." The first major twist struck like a physical blow. As Elena began to download the encrypted files she had mirrored from Julian's server months ago, as a fail-safe she hoped she'd never use, a notification flashed red across the screen. "System breach, Vault 7. He didn't just vow to replace me," Elena gasped, her face draining of what little color remained. "Dominic has already triggered the purge. He's using Julian's authorization codes to wipe the offshore accounts and frame me for the theft. Julian thinks I'm running away with his fortune. He's going to send a hit squad, Clara. He won't just replace me, he's going to try to erase me." The shock of the realization was followed by a sudden, jarring crash at the front of the boutique. The glass shattered, and through the shards stepped a man Elena recognized all too well. Rick Deckard, named for a hunter of androids and a pilot of the stars, the most ruthless mercenary on Julian's payroll. But he didn't raise his weapon. He looked at Elena, then at the glowing screen. "Julian sent me to bring back your head," Rick said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "But I've watched you for 3 years, Elena. I know you didn't do it. And I know what's growing inside you." The room spun. The man sent to kill her was the first person to offer a hand. "The Viduvas are already at the estate," Rick continued. "They aren't there for a wedding. They're there for a funeral. Julian's." Elena's heart hammered against her ribs. She had every reason to let Julian burn. He had discarded her like trash. He had insulted her devotion. But as she looked at Rick, she realized that if Julian fell tonight, the Empire would become a slaughterhouse and her child would never see the light of day. "We're going back," Elena declared, her voice regaining its steel. "Not as his wife. As the only person who can keep him alive long enough to realize how wrong he is." The rain turned into a torrential downpour as Rick's armored sedan tore through the slick streets toward the Thorne estate. Inside the cabin, the air was thick with the scent of ozone and Elena's mounting dread. She wasn't just a woman in flight anymore. She was a tactician back on the field, her mind racing through the security protocols she had helped Julian design. "If Julian sees you, he'll pull the trigger himself," Rick Deckard warned, his eyes fixed on the rearview mirror, watching for the headlights of the Viduva scouts he knew were trailing them. "He's in a state of scorched earth. To him, your absence is the ultimate admission of guilt." "Then I can't let him see me until I've neutralized the threat," Elena replied, her fingers flying across an encrypted tablet she'd taken from Clara's shop. "Dominic isn't just letting the Viduvas in. He's disabled the heat signature grid in the West Wing. That's where Julian will be meeting Sienna Miller. It's a kill zone." As they neared the perimeter, the tension between Elena and Rick crackled. There was a strange, silent understanding between them. The mercenary who lived by a code and the woman who had been betrayed by the man she'd sacrificed everything for. "Why are you helping me, Rick?" Elena asked, her voice barely a whisper over the roar of the engine. "You've taken his money for years." Rick didn't look away from the road. "Julian Thorne is a man who forgot that power is built on people, not just fear. You were the only one who reminded him of that. Without you, he's just another corpse in a tailored suit. And I don't like seeing good work go to waste." They breached the outer gates through a blind spot Elena had kept off the official records for years. A ghost gate, intended for an emergency escape that she was now using for an emergency infiltration. As they slipped into the shadows of the manicured gardens, the first obstacle appeared. A 3-man patrol led by Artie Buccio, first name of a chef, last name of a mob associate, a loyalist who was too jumpy for his own good. Elena didn't hesitate. She used the estate's own internal comms to trigger a false alarm in the wine cellar, drawing the patrol away. She was a ghost in her own home, moving through the topiary with a lethal grace that Julian had never truly appreciated. Inside the grand ballroom, the scene was a masquerade of diplomacy. Julian stood under the crystal chandelier, looking every bit the king, while Sienna Miller stood before him. She was beautiful in a sharp, predatory way, her eyes scanning the room like a hawk. "My father is eager for this union," Sienna said, her voice like silk over a blade. "But he's concerned about the clutter. He hears your former woman is still unaccounted for." Julian's grip tightened on his glass. "Elena is a ghost. She no longer exists in this world." From the shadows of the mezzanine, Elena watched the exchange, her heart fracturing anew at the coldness in his voice. But she saw what Julian didn't. The way Sienna's bodyguards were subtly positioning themselves at every exit, their hands resting on the suppressed submachine guns hidden beneath their coats. They weren't there for a celebration. They were there for an execution. Elena felt a sharp pang in her abdomen, a reminder of the life she was carrying. It steeled her. She began planting false clues within the estate's digital network, overriding the security cameras to show a looped feed of an empty hallway while she and Rick moved into position. But then a red herring she hadn't anticipated tripped her up. A secondary security team, not Julian's and not the Viduvas, appeared on the monitors. Dominic Toretto had hired outside contractors to ensure that neither Julian nor the Viduvas walked out of that room alive. He wanted to inherit the ashes. "Rick," Elena hissed into her earpiece. "The West Wing is a trap, but the basement is already being rigged with thermite. Dominic is going to level the whole house." The frustration peaked. She was one woman against two different betrayals, trying to save a man who wanted her dead. For a fleeting second, hope flickered. Could she really pull this off? Or was she just making it easier for them to bury her alongside him? "I'm going in," Elena whispered. "I have to get to the breaker room. If I can't kill the lights, I can't get Julian out of there." The air in the subterranean corridors was heavy with the scent of damp concrete and the metallic tang of high explosives. Elena's fingers danced across the central junction box, her breath coming in shallow, jagged hitches. This was the heart of the Thorn estate, the place where she had once helped Julian install a state-of-the-art encryption grid to keep the world out. Now it was a tomb in the making. As she bypassed the final firewall to kill the estate's power, a shadow detached itself from the darkness of the server racks. Elena spun, her hand flying to the small dagger concealed in her boot, but she froze. It wasn't a guard. It was Dominic Toretto. He wasn't holding a weapon. He was holding a glass of Julian's finest vintage, a celebratory smirk playing on his lips. "I knew you couldn't stay away, Elena," Dominic purred, his voice echoing in the confined space. "You always had a hero complex. It's what made you so easy to frame." "You did this," Elena hissed, her eyes blazing. "You fed him the lies about the dock shipments. You're the one who sold out the longshoremen to the Veduvas." Dominic laughed, a dry, rattling sound. "Oh, Elena. You're still thinking too small. I didn't just sell the shipments. I sold the legacy. I've been working with the Veduvas since before you even met Julian. But you were the problem. You looked at the ledgers too closely. You noticed the 3% discrepancy in the laundering cycle. I had to make him hate you or he would have eventually listened to you." The revelation hit Elena like a physical blow, shifting the entire trajectory of her mission. It wasn't just a misunderstanding. It was a years-long meticulously crafted execution of her character. Julian hadn't just been paranoid. He had been systematically poisoned against her by his most trusted friend. "But here's the game changer," Dominic continued, stepping closer into the dim emergency light. "Julian didn't just vow to replace you because he thought you were a traitor. He did it because he found the medical records. The ones I planted." Elena's heart stopped. "What records?" "The ones stating that the child you're carrying isn't his," Dominic whispered with a venomous grin. "I forged a paternity report with the Veduva's doctor. Julian doesn't just think you betrayed the business, he thinks you betrayed the one thing he actually valued, his bloodline. That's why he wants you erased. He thinks you're carrying a rival's brat." The stakes shattered the ceiling. The vulnerability she felt wasn't just for herself anymore, but for the innocent life Julian now viewed as a mark of shame. The betrayal was absolute, reaching into the very core of their shared history. Suddenly, the comms in Elena's ear crackled. It was Rick Deckard. "Elena. The Veduvas just drew their weapons in the ballroom. Julian is pinned down behind the dais. And the thermite. The timers just went active. We have 7 minutes." "Dominic," Elena said, her voice dropping to a terrifying low frequency. "You should have killed me when you had the chance." With a movement so fast it seemed a blur, Elena didn't go for her knife. She slammed her palm into the emergency purge button on the console, not to kill the lights but to trigger the fire suppression gas. As the room filled with a thick white haze, Elena used the chaos to slip past Dominic, leaving him coughing and blinded in the dark. She sprinted toward the service elevator. She had to get to the ballroom. She had to stand in front of the man who hated her and tell him the truth while the house burned down around them. The determination in her chest was no longer fueled by love alone. It was fueled by a cold, righteous passion. Julian Thorne was a fool, but he was her fool, and no one, not the Veduvas and certainly not a snake like Dominic, was going to take his life or the reputation of her child. She reached the ballroom level just as the first exchange of gunfire erupted, the sound of shattering crystal and screaming guests filling the air. She saw Julian through the gap in the double doors. He was out of ammo, backed into a corner, staring into the barrel of Sienna Miller's gold-plated pistol. "Any last words for the man who thought he could replace a Veduva?" Sienna mocked. Julian didn't look at her. He looked at the door as if sensing the ghost who had been haunting his halls. The ballroom was no longer a place of opulence. It was a slaughterhouse of shattered glass and dying echoes. As the fire suppression gas from the lower levels began to seep through the vents, a ghostly white mist curled around the legs of the fallen. Elena watched from the mezzanine, her heart fracturing as she saw Julian, the man who had once been her son, forced onto his knees. Sienna Miller stood over him, the gold-plated pistol pressed against his temple. The Veduva mercenaries had formed a lethal circle, their weapons pointed inward. "Where is the Prometheus file, Julian?" Sienna demanded, her voice cutting through the smoke. "Dominic said you kept the physical drive in the ballroom safe. Give it to me and I might make your death quick." Julian looked up at her, a smear of blood across his cheek, his eyes vacant. The realization that his empire was a house of cards built by a traitor had finally broken him. "It doesn't matter," he rasped. "The woman who held the key is gone. I sent her to the grave myself." From her vantage point, Elena felt the crushing weight of despair. To save him she had to reveal herself, but to reveal herself was to face the man who believed she had carried another man's child to humiliate him. She was separated from him by a sea of killers and a mountain of lies. Suddenly the floor beneath them shuddered. The thermite charges in the basement had begun their slow, agonizing burn. The structural integrity of the Thorne estate was failing. "I don't have time for this," Sienna hissed. She cocked the hammer of the pistol. "Wait." The scream tore from Elena's throat before she could stop it. She stepped out onto the mezzanine railing, her silhouette framed by the flickering emergency lights. The mercenaries swung their rifles upward, but Sienna held up a hand, a cruel smile spreading across her face. "The ghost returns," Sienna mocked. "The traitor come to save her king. Elena, run." Julian roared, the sound of her name breaking the catatonic trance he'd been in. But his voice lacked its usual command. It was a plea of a man who had realized too late that he had thrown away the only thing that mattered. "She has the files, Sienna. She's the one who robbed me. Kill her." The words felt like a physical stabbing. Even now, with death staring him in the face, Julian still believed the poison Dominic had poured into his ear. He truly thought she was his enemy. The separation between them wasn't just the distance of the ballroom. It was a chasm of absolute, heartbreaking distrust. "He thinks you're a whore and a thief, Elena," Sienna laughed, looking up at her. "Is he really worth the bullet I'm about to put in you?" Elena looked down at Julian. He looked small. He looked lost. And for a moment the situation appeared utterly hopeless. He stayed, they both died. She fled, he died thinking she was the monster Dominic created. The building groaned again, a support beam in the far corner snapping with the sound of a gunshot. The heat was rising through the floorboards. "I'm not here for him," Elena lied, her voice trembling with a desperation she could no longer hide. "I'm here for the drive. I have the secondary encryption key. Without it, the Prometheus file is just junk code. Let him go and I'll give it to you." Julian stared at her, his eyes filling with a horrific mixture of hate and agonizing longing. "You really did take it," he whispered, the last spark of hope in his eyes dying out. He didn't see the tear that escaped Elena's eye as she reached into her pocket. She wasn't holding a key. She was holding the anniversary gift, the small velvet-lined box. "I'm sorry, Julian," she whispered to the wind. Below them, the fire reached the main gas line. A muffled explosion rocked the west wing, and the massive crystal chandelier above Julian's head began to groan, its chain slipping. The hour was as dark as it could get. The love was gone, the truth was buried, and the roof was coming down. The massive chandelier gave a final, metallic shriek as the ceiling joists buckled. But before it could plummet and crush Julian, the ballroom was plunged into a strobe-like chaos. Rick Deckard had finally reached the secondary breaker, detonating the localized EMP Elena had prepared. The electronic sights on the mercenaries' rifles went dead, and the gold-plated pistol in Sienna's hand glinted uselessly in the sudden dark. "Now!" Elena screamed. She didn't jump into the fray. She used the one thing Julian had taught her, the layout of the vents. She dropped through the service chute behind the mezzanine, sliding down into the thick of the smoke. While the Veduva men scrambled, Elena emerged like a wraith beside Julian. She didn't waste time with a romantic reunion. She slammed a pair of heavy-duty noise-canceling headphones, snatched from a security locker, onto Julian's head and shoved him flat against the floor. "Stay down," she yelled over the roar of the fire. The heat from the thermite below finally hit the estate's automated defense system. High-frequency sonic emitters, designed to incapacitate intruders, roared to life. The Veduva mercenaries dropped their weapons, clutching their ears as blood leaked from their literal senses. Elena, shielded by her own smaller earplugs, grabbed Julian's discarded handgun. Elena. Julian gasped, his vision swimming. He looked at her, really looked at her as she stood over him, shielding his body with her own. Dominic lied, Julian, she shouted, the words tearing from her chest. He's been working with the Viduvas for years. The files, the leak, the paternity test, it was all him. He wanted you to discard me so he could take the docs without me spotting the trail. The realization hit Julian like a tidal wave. He saw the fire, he saw the mercenaries, and he saw the woman he had vowed to replace. The woman he had called a traitor, risking her life to stand in the path of a falling empire for him. The inner strength he had lost to paranoia suddenly fused with a burning, righteous fury. The Prometheus file isn't in the safe, Julian rasped, reaching up to grip Elena's hand. His touch was cold, but his eyes were finally clear. I moved it to the one place Dominic could never go. Your jewelry box, Elena. I put it there the night I said those things. The key to the entire conflict was never a digital code. It was a physical drive hidden in the very symbol of the life he had tried to throw away. We have to go, Elena urged, pulling him to his feet. Rick is clearing a path to the garage. If we don't move now, the thermite will take the foundation. At that moment, the double doors burst open. It wasn't the Viduvas. It was Dominic Toretto, his face scorched and his eyes manic. He held a detonator in one hand and a submachine gun in the other. No one leaves. Dominic screamed. If I don't get the docs, no one gets the Thorn name. But Julian didn't flinch. He stepped in front of Elena, his stature returning, his hand steady on the weapon she had given him. He wasn't the broken man on his knees anymore. He was a king who had finally realized who his queen truly was. You made one mistake, Dominic, Julian said, his voice a low, lethal vibration. You thought she was my weakness. You never realized she was the only reason I was strong. With a roar of defiance, the two of them moved as one, a united front against the architect of their misery. Hope didn't just flicker. It blazed brighter than the fire consuming the house. The air was a toxic cocktail of ozone, smoke, and the searing heat of the approaching inferno. Dominic Toretto stood at the threshold of the crumbling ballroom, his thumb trembling over the detonator. To his left, Sienna Miller struggled to her feet, her gold pistol leveled at Elena's heart. They were the two heads of a hydra that had been strangling the Thorn legacy for years. Give me the drive, Julian. Dominic screamed, his voice cracking under the strain of the shifting floor. Give it to me or we all burn in this hell you built. Julian didn't look at the detonator. He didn't even look at the gun pointed at him. He looked at Elena, and for the first time in years, there was no shadow of doubt in his eyes, only a profound, shattering clarity. He reached out and took the small velvet box from her hand, the anniversary gift she had been clutching throughout the chaos. You want the secret to the Thorn Empire, Dominic? Julian's voice was as cold and steady as a mountain stream. It was never the money. It was never the docs. With a flick of his wrist, Julian tossed the velvet box toward Dominic. Greed, instinctive and corrosive, forced Dominic to reach out with his gun hand to catch it. In that split second of diverted focus, the partnership between Julian and Elena, forged in years of silent understanding, snapped into action. Elena didn't fire at Dominic. She fired at the weakened chain of the remaining section of the crystal chandelier directly above Sienna. The heavy iron link shattered. With a roar of falling glass and metal, the chandelier plummeted, pinning Sienna beneath a ton of crystal and steel before she could pull her trigger. Simultaneously, Julian lunged. He didn't use a bullet. He used the raw, primal strength of a man protecting his bloodline. He tackled Dominic just as the traitor tried to depress the detonator. They hit the floor, sliding across the slick marble toward the edge of the collapsing mezzanine. You destroyed her. Julian roared, pinning Dominic's wrist to the floor. You made me doubt the only truth I ever had. She was just a tool. Dominic gasped, his face turning purple under Julian's grip. I would have been a better king. A king knows the difference between a crown and a soul, Julian hissed. With a decisive strike, Julian disarmed the detonator and sent it skittering into the flames. He didn't kill Dominic. He did something far worse for a man of Dominic's ambition. He reached into the velvet box Dominic still held, which Elena had filled not with a drive, but with a simple silver locket containing the ultrasound photo she had intended to show him. "Look at it," Julian commanded. "Look at the life you tried to erase." Dominic's eyes widened as he saw the image. The weight of his failure, the realization that he hadn't just betrayed a boss, but had tried to murder an unborn child, seemed to sap the last of his strength. From the shadows, Rick Deckard appeared, his tactical gear scorched but his expression grimly satisfied. He stepped forward and zip-tied Dominic's hands with a brutal efficiency. "The police and the feds are 3 minutes out, Julian. I leaked the Prometheus file to the Attorney General's private server. It's over. The Viduvas are being rounded up at the docks as we speak." Julian stood up, the roar of the fire now a backdrop to a sudden ringing silence. The Empire was burning. The Thorn estate, a monument to his pride and paranoia, was being reclaimed by the earth. But as he turned to Elena, he didn't see the ruins. He saw the woman who had walked through fire to save a man who didn't deserve her. He walked to her, his steps heavy with the weight of 1,000 apologies he hadn't yet spoken. Elena stood her ground, her face smudged with soot, her eyes never leaving his. "You stayed," Julian whispered, his voice breaking. "After everything I said, after the replacement, why did you stay?" Elena reached out, her fingers brushing the blood from his brow. "Because I knew the man who vowed to replace me wasn't the man I loved. He was just a ghost being haunted by a liar." As the roof finally caved in on the far side of the wing, Julian swept her into his arms. It wasn't a movie kiss, it was a desperate, gasping reclamation. They stood amidst the ashes of their old life, two people stripped of their titles and their armor, left only with the truth. Justice hadn't just been served to the traitors. It had been served to the lies that had nearly kept them apart. The first light of dawn broke over the horizon, painting the smoking ruins of the Thorn estate in hues of gold and lavender. The sirens had faded into the distance, taking Dominic Toretto and the remnants of the Viduva syndicate toward a life behind bars. The Thorn Empire, as the world knew it, the violence, the shadows, the cold calculation, had been purified by the very fire meant to destroy it. Julian and Elena stood by the edge of the cliffs overlooking the sea, far from the reach of the reporters and the investigators. The air here was salt-stung and clean. Julian had stripped off his charred suit jacket, standing in a simple white shirt that caught the morning breeze. He looked younger, the hard lines of paranoia that had defined his face for years finally softening into something resembling peace. "I spent my whole life building walls," Julian said, his voice low and steady as he looked out at the water. "I thought if I made them thick enough nothing could hurt me. I didn't realize I was just building my own prison." Elena stepped up beside him, her hand finding his. Their fingers intertwined, a silent vow that needed no ceremony. "The walls are gone, Julian. You don't have to be the boss anymore. You just have to be a father." Julian turned to her, his eyes shining with a vulnerability he would have once considered a death sentence. He knelt on the grass, pressing his forehead gently against her stomach. He stayed there for a long moment, listening to the silent promise of the future, a tear finally escaping and disappearing into the fabric of Elena's dress. He wasn't mourning the house or the money, he was grieving the time he had lost to the lies. "I will spend every day of the rest of my life earning back the place I threw away," Julian whispered. "Not the seat at the table. The seat beside you." The transition was seamless. With the evidence from the Prometheus file and Rick Deckard's testimony, the Thorn name was cleared of the most heinous charges, but Julian chose to walk away from the life of crime entirely. They relocated to a quiet coastal town under names that didn't carry the weight of a blood-soaked history. 6 months later, the replacement Julian had once vowed to find was a distant, dark memory. In her place was a nursery filled with soft light and the scent of lavender. Clara Oswald visited often, bringing news of a world that was slowly healing, while Rick Deckard remained a silent guardian in the shadows, finally working for a family he truly respected. The story of the boss who tried to replace his heart ended not with a bang, but with a soft, rhythmic rocking of a cradle. Julian had learned the hardest lesson of all. Power is hollow without the person who knows your soul. He hadn't just survived a betrayal. He had been reborn through the love of the woman he was too blind to see. As the sun fully rose, illuminating their new home, Elena looked at Julian, the man who was now her partner in every sense of the word. They had lost an empire, but they had gained a world. The secret that could have destroyed him had instead become the foundation of their new life. Thank you so much for staying with us through this journey of shadows and redemption. It's been an emotional ride and we're so glad we could share it with you. What did you think of Julian's transformation? Do you think he did enough to earn Elena's forgiveness? Let us know in the comments below. We love hearing your theories and thoughts. And if this story touched your heart, please subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell. We have so many more stories of love, mystery, and resilience to tell, and we want you there for every single one. Until next time, remember that the most powerful secrets are the ones we keep for love.